Hello and welcome to Keep the Bastards Honest, the podcast of the Australian Democrats. I'm your host, Elana Mitchell, and on this episode, it's an education election. I feel like education is possibly the third pillar of the cost of living crisis, in that it impacts young people and their families at almost every stage of life before the age of 30. So I'm going to take you through the suite of policies we've developed for each stage of education. And then, because I'm nothing if not a completionist, I'm also going to add art, science, and civics to the curriculum. Before we get started, I wanted to do a quick shout out to a couple of new favourites of the podcast. Heath Blyde, who I had the great pleasure of meeting and chatting to at the Hyde Park Festival back in March. Heath volunteered on the spot to help Lisa Griffith's independent campaign in the WA state election and earned instant forever favourite status with her. And Ben Pompey, who wrote into the info@democrats.org.au email address asking how he could help out on the federal election campaign, and happened to mention that he was a big fan of the podcast, which has earned him instant forever favourite status with me. And Ben, if I have somehow mangled the pronunciation of your surname, I do apologise. Being an evidence-informed podcast, I did try Googling it to get a pronunciation guide, but got no definitive answer. Please feel free to write in and tell me how badly I stuffed up. If you would like to earn forever favourite status and a shout out on the podcast, join the party and volunteer to help out like Heath and Ben did. As a minor party with no big corporate donors, no government funding, and no big investment angels like Climate 200 backing us, we rely entirely on the support and efforts of our members and supporters to get the word out. The mainstream media is entirely hostile to independents and minor parties who threaten the status quo. And while social media advertising is cheap and effective when compared to traditional advertising, it still requires large, long-term investments to reach people. I think one thing Australians can all agree on is that the two-party duopoly is no longer serving our interests. But if you want to see yourself reflected in the people elected to represent you, there's no avoiding the fact that you have to step up and get involved and create the change you want to see. Ask any community independent campaign. They'll tell you that there's no grassroots political movement without people choosing to step up and invest their time and energy in a cause bigger than themselves. We need hundreds of people like Ben and Heath, and cloning is still technologically unfeasible and also highly unethical. So we're going to have to do this the hard way. Go to democrats.org.au to join or donate and become my new favourite. So with that said, let's go to school. This episode was written, recorded and produced in Whadjuk country. I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of these lands and their elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded. We're starting with early childhood education and care. As I mentioned in a previous episode, this is very much a cost of living issue since childcare costs are an enormous impost on young families and a huge barrier to women returning to the workforce. But it's also an education and an equity issue. And I couldn't really pull this particular policy platform into the cost of living episode without then also pulling the other two education policies with it, which is why you're listening to a dedicated education episode. So here are the issues with early childhood education. Every child deserves the best possible start in life. Where you live and your parents' cultural heritage should not be a barrier. According to the Productivity Commission, early childhood education and care is critical to the well-being of families. Unfortunately, the children who would benefit the most from access to early childhood education and care are attending less than average or not at all. Research by the Centre for Policy Development shows Australian families pay some of the highest rates in the OECD for childcare. Yet 22% of Australian children start school developmentally vulnerable, and 126,000 children are missing out on early learning due to activity test rules. There are complex subsidy and funding arrangements, lack of accessibility for many families experiencing disadvantage, a shortage of educators and services, and high costs for parents and families. Employees in the sector are among the lowest paid of all professions, with median weekly earnings less than 2/3 of median adult earnings. The average pay for childcare workers in Melbourne is $25.80 an hour. Attracting and retaining workers in the sector has been a chronic problem. In New South Wales, vacancies outstrip applications. Cost of living pressures and stagnant wages are impacting the ability to afford care, leading to a catch-22 of needing to work to live, but not being able to afford the care that will enable parents to go out to work. Women are disproportionately impacted by this. So, our plan is to provide a funding model that delivers universal access to quality, culturally safe, and inclusive early childhood education and care. For early childhood education and care to be part of the education system, improving educators' pay, status, and conditions, bringing workers to the sector. Increase investment in services in unserved and underserved communities, particularly in lower socioeconomic, rural, and remote areas. Provide mentoring programs, coaching, and counselling for early childhood educators. Overhaul administrative burdens so that educators are free to educate. And bring forward the federal government's timeframe for the new proposed early childhood education and care system and adopt all the recommendations of the Productivity Commission. Now, here's the evidence. The Productivity Commission made 56 recommendations in September 2024 to reform early childhood funding in their report, A Path to Universal Early Childhood Education and Care. These reforms would substantially increase affordability of and access to childcare. However, it will be progressively rolled out over the next 12 years. The measures will increase childcare costs by 37% and eventually reach $17.4 billion a year. It calls for major reforms, including ensuring all children have access to a minimum of 3 days of early childhood education and care per week at low or no cost, and replacing current funding arrangements with direct, base-level funding for all providers, supplemented by additional needs-based and service-based funding to cover specific costs. Here is what the federal government is proposing. All children to get 3 days a week of childcare by 2036. The maximum rate of the childcare subsidy to be raised from 90% to 100% of the hourly rate cap for families on incomes up to $80,000, making childcare more affordable from 2026 for about 30% of all families with children aged 0 to 12 years. Subsidies to be raised to 100% for families with multiple children under 5, earning under $140,000 a year, up from the current 95%. And subsidies were increased in 2023. The activity test that requires parents to be working or studying at least 8 hours a fortnight is to be removed. Funding for remote and very remote areas to be equitable. And access to childcare subsidy for wraparound care in dedicated preschools is to be available by 2025. Next up, schooling. Our National President, Lynn Ellison, was a teacher, an art teacher, in fact, before she went into politics. And both historically and today, we've had a lot of teachers as members of the party. Education is one of those items that is, I think, fundamental to who the Democrats are as a party. And that in turn is reflected in the next two policy platforms. So, first up, schooling. Here's the issues. Most young Australians receive a good education and perform above the OECD average for mathematics, reading, and science. However, performance has declined at all levels of achievement compared with international benchmarks. There is also a high concentration of disadvantaged students in many schools, and the gap between students in the top and bottom socioeconomic quintiles is widening, entrenching and compounding disadvantage. More than a decade after the Gonski Review, the Schooling Resource Standard was finally set up, but is not yet fully delivered. An interjection from me, for once while I'm recording and not after I'm editing, I do believe that in the lead up to the federal election of 2025, Gonski was finally fully delivered, with Queensland coming on board. That might be a walk of shame I might have to check that. Teacher shortages are already alarming. Teachers are leaving the profession early, and fewer people want to be teachers. Segregation of students has increased dramatically, with funding for private schools rising to nearly 5 times the rate of government schools. So, our plan: deliver 100% of the schooling resource standard funding, at least by January 2025. Generously fund schools with concentrations of educational disadvantage so they can retain effective teachers and leaders. Explore interventions that would help desegregate schools, such as setting conditions for non-government school funding and moving towards fee removal, strengthening and regulating accountability for funding, reducing selectivity, building the evidence base for desegregation, take a First Nations-led approach to First Nations education policy, remove tax deductibility for donations to non-government schools, and for the states, reduce teacher workloads, especially non-teaching tasks, fund specialised training in managing complex educational settings, provide more quality professional development, mentoring, and coaching. Provide better incentives, enhance career pathways, and better employment conditions to attract and retain teachers and school staff. Address the needs of students in regional, rural, and remote locations, students with disability, and those from educationally disadvantaged backgrounds. Ensure that young parents are accommodated in all schools with supports that provide access to education. Collect data and knowledge concerning what appears to be an increase in school refusals. Here's the evidence to back all it up. First, the money. Gonski stressed the need for an equitable school funding model that would ensure differences in educational outcomes are not the result of differences in wealth, income, power, or possessions. The Gonski Review Panel said the needs of priority equity cohorts, including First Nation students, students living in regional, rural, and remote locations, students with disability, and students from educationally disadvantaged backgrounds, must be urgently addressed. The quasi-market-based nature of the Australian education system leads to limited socio-educational diversity in some schools and entrenches disadvantage for many students. Private schools receive both government funding and unlimited fees, philanthropy, and tax-deductible donations. The Australian Productivity Commission overview, page 15, recommended abolition of DGR for this purpose on the grounds that it was inequitable. Now, for those of you who are not sure what that acronym was, DGR is Deductible Gift Recipient Status, which means that private schools can receive donations from alumni and others, and then those donations are in turn tax deductible. It's quite the insidious loophole. The Gonski Review recalled for 5 areas of reform. But more than 10 years on, there is still a shortfall in the schooling resource standard, with the states funding public schools at 75% of the SRS and the Commonwealth 20%, with the 5% remainder the subject of ongoing negotiations. Now, as I said before, in the lead up to the 2025 election, I believe those negotiations have now been completed across all states. So there's that. Now we get on to the segregation. Quoting Jane Caro, novelist, writer, and social commentator from the Saturday paper, Australia now has one of the most segregated schooling systems in the OECD, thanks to the growing concentration of disadvantaged students in disadvantaged schools. Our position is worsening at the second fastest rate. Choice, competition between schools, and big increases in funding by the Howard government fostered a significant increase in the growth of non-government schools and with it, greater segregation. In 2024, enrolments in independent and faith-based schools reached 36%, an increase of 3 to 4% each year for the last 3 years. For secondary schools, it is 41%. Australia has one of the highest proportions of students in non-government schools in the OECD. The sector also became highly segregated by ethnicity, religion, and class. The OECD argues reducing school segregation is one of the best ways to reduce achievement gaps between advantaged and disadvantaged students and improve educational effectiveness more generally. Previous research linked school segregation with other inequalities. For instance, schools that mainly serve disadvantaged students can struggle to attract and retain experienced teachers. In Australia, non government schools receive government funding without regulation of how much they can charge or how they enrol students. This is unusual in world terms. In most OECD countries, if private schools receive government funds, they must not charge any tuition fees. While better funding for disadvantaged students is essential, the government appears to have balked at measures that might desegregate the school system. The government commissioned review of policy interventions to increase socio-economic diversity and improve learning outcomes in 2023 suggests targeted removal of fees or fee capping could be effective, amongst other interventions. To quote Andreas Schleicher, OECD Education Director, the more discretion and autonomy that schools have, the stronger the central regulatory frameworks must be. And quoting the OECD's report, PISA Results, Balancing Choice and Equity, it is important to note that where other policy interventions have succeeded in increasing diversity and achievement, such as financial incentives in England and Wales, or alternative models of delivery in New Zealand, this has occurred within a context where fees have been removed as a factor in segregation. In Australia, fee removal may similarly be most effective if deployed in concert with other policy interventions. Page 15. Parents in the Netherlands have created approximately 90 parent groups that use school choice as an effective means to desegregate schools and provide a quality education for all. Teachers. We must invest and trust in teachers, find ways to lift their esteem, build professional capacity, and have them teach in equitable, well-resourced schools. Australia's universities graduate around 16,000 new teachers a year, but at least 4,000 extra teachers will be needed for the growth of school students. Worsening the problem is the decline in the number of people who want to train as teachers and more teachers leaving the profession early. In November, the New South Wales Department of Education reported then 10,000 classes per day not being adequately staffed due to shortages. Quoting the current Education Minister, Jason Clare, teachers do the most important job in the world. And the truth is, we don't have enough of them. In the 2024 State of Our School survey, 19% of principals said they didn't have enough classrooms at their schools, 40% said they wouldn't have sufficient space to meet enrolments in the next 3 to 5 years, 83% of principals reported teacher shortages at their school, and 93% said it had become harder to fill vacant positions. Despite the dedication and efforts of teachers, these demands are taking a toll on the workforce and undermining the sector's ability to attract and retain teachers. Many teachers do not feel adequately recognised or valued. Violence and bullying by students and parents may be another factor. First Nations. Far too many First Nation students are not reaching their full learning potential. To better support these students, there should be a First Nations-led approach to developing a First Nations education policy. And finally, young parents. In 2021, there were 4,769 babies born to teenagers of school age. Of almost 700 secondary schools in Australia, only 23 provide formal education and support to enable young mothers to complete their secondary education. Data is not collected on the number of parenting students in schools. However, a rough calculation suggests it is less than 5% of all young mothers. The purpose-built secondary college, CC Cares, is one of the exemplars providing expert teaching, flexible learning programs, childcare, transport, parenting skills, mental health and other supports currently provided for 140 young mothers in the ACT and Queanbeyan. Nationwide, governments declare that young people are entitled, indeed required, to be in education, but do not make it possible when there are so few school services for this vulnerable group. So let's take a look next at higher education. Alrighty, higher education. The Australia Institute, in its report on public attitudes on issues in higher education, says stronger public universities are vital to the success of dynamic, innovative economies, and more inclusive labour markets. But decades of fiscal restraint and corporatisation have eroded the democratic governance and equitable delivery of public higher education in Australia. Stronger public universities are vital to the success of dynamic, innovative economies and more inclusive labour markets. But decades of fiscal restraint and corporatisation have eroded the democratic governance and equitable delivery of public higher education in Australia. The issues. On a per student basis, federal government funding for universities has declined significantly in the last decade. 40% of jobs at public universities are now casual. Degrees are now more expensive, and higher education debt doubled since 2008. Tuition fees are 51% of total funding for universities in Australia. Future challenges for universities are the rise of generative AI and other digital technologies that are changing how students and researchers work, changes in the sources of authority and knowledge, and competition from outside the sector. The geopolitical landscape is also changing dramatically, and government priorities, for instance, dealing with climate action, resilience, and national security, are bringing pressure on universities. Australia's population is ageing, and demographics suggest the absolute number of people at Australia's traditional post-school university age will soon decline. Furthermore, universities are widely seen as heavily regulated, conservative in their practices, and with entrenched cultures that resist change. For instance, most of the university research isn't applied to university practices, even where relevant. Limits have been imposed on international students in part because of domestic concerns about housing shortages. And a post-2025 budget update to this policy, the discredited Jobs Ready graduate scheme is to continue with no change to increased fees for humanities and arts established by the Morrison government. So our plan: increase funding for universities to at least 0.9% of GDP, reduce tuition fees to match the OECD average, and substantially reduce the HELP, formerly HECS, debt. Consider the financial and family circumstances of students in determining the HELP repayment. Reverse the previous government's Jobs Ready Graduates package that substantially increased fees for the humanities, arts, and social sciences. Remove the national interest test and vetoes by government ministers on grants. Explore micro-credentials that are, for instance, more inclusive of disadvantaged people. Embrace digital technology as a flexible enabler, especially for geographically dispersed workforces. Improve and properly fund the application of research by universities. Now, the evidence that backs this up says the Albanese government promised a 20% cut in what is now the HELP debt, an increase in the income threshold for compulsory repayments, and changing the amounts to be paid. However, the most recently released tax statistics indicate more than 70% of those required to make a HELP repayment in 2021-2022 earned between $60,000 and $120,000. Only 20% earned more than $120,000, and less than 10% earned less than $60,000. Under the Morrison government's package of university fee rates, humanities and arts courses are not considered to be national priority areas. So student contributions were lifted to $14,500, with a government contribution of $1,100. The scheme features fee increases of as much as 117%. Note, that is 117. And as we said earlier, this is still in place. The Albanese government has not addressed this on any level. All other disciplines attract student fees of between $3,950 and $7,950, except clinical subjects such as medicine, which cost $11,500, while government contributions range from $13,250 to $27,000. In 2022, the Productivity Commission slammed the Job Ready Graduates package, describing it as dysfunctional and counterproductive. It noted that price did not affect demand and argued skills shortages were a poor basis for setting subsidies because students made good choices of their own volition, and that forward-looking students would respond to rising wages and strong employment prospects. Quoting the interpreter, reliance on international student fees has complemented the parsimony with which Australia invests in its higher learning and research. 1.7% of GDP directed towards research and development, compared to the 2.7% that is the OECD average. Australia's public spending on tertiary education at 0.7% also renders it a laggard among developed countries, averaging at 1%. In 2024, there were more than 1 million international student enrolments in Australia. The federal government proposes to cap international student numbers allowed to start studying in Australia to 270,000, and the visa fee would be doubled. And the outcome of this is uncertain. So that's it for our education policies. Now for the arts. The arts have a long tradition of shaping our society and have an important part to play in our future. They help define and negotiate who we are, what we believe in, what we value, and what we aspire to. In 2024, the federal budget for the arts, Revive, was $949.5 million over 4 years. However, this fund does not fully address the immediate challenges for the arts industry, particularly skills and training, business recovery, rebuilding financial reserves, or practical actions to support safe workplaces. So our plan is as follows. Better fund small and medium-sized festivals to cover rising costs or perhaps government underwritten insurance. Restore funding to arts training colleges. Resume funding for Craft Australia. Set music quotas of, say, 25% for Australian content on commercial radio and streaming platforms such as Spotify and Apple Music. Remove the 1% cap on what recording artists can receive from radio for their sound recording. Value and promote Australia's unique Indigenous arts culture, voice and stories. Establish an industry award under the Fair Work Commission for minimum pay rates for the arts and cultural sector. A basic income support scheme of around $600 a week for up to 5,000 individual artists, writers, dancers, theatre makers and filmmakers. A program for employing artists and residents in schools, art centres, libraries, etc. And tax deductions for philanthropic support for individual artists. So here's the evidence to support all of this. Since COVID, fewer Australians are engaging with live arts events. Just over half of music festivals made a profit in 2023-24, and several major festivals had to be cancelled due to increased costs and a general lack of confidence. An ABC survey found 55% of musicians thought about leaving the music industry, and now the vast majority of musicians work outside the industry. Funding for Arts 8, a collective of creative arts training colleges, including the Australian Ballet School, the Australian National Academy of Music, the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, and the Australian Youth Orchestra has gone backwards, falling below the level it was at 10 years ago. Artists as workers. Artists and arts workers are underpaid and undervalued. 61% of visual artists make less than $10,000 per year from their creative work, and their incomes are declining. A survey by Creative Australia of 600 professional artists in 2021-22 showed their average income for creative work was a mere $23,200 a year. This makes it difficult for artists to earn a living or to have success in making art and developing ideas and imagination. It's worth noting that 74% of artists hold a university degree compared to 36% in the general workforce. Our income support scheme would require artists to fulfill 2 of 3 criteria: have earned an income from the arts for at least 2 years, have an existing body of creative work, and be a member of a recognised art body. For this investment, the annual cost would be around $1.6 million a year. An ongoing program for employing artists in residence in schools, art centres, libraries, universities, hospitals, councils, and government departments would have significant benefits. And in the show notes, we'll provide a link to the article that covers that. For live music, Minister Burke promised quotas for Australian music on commercial radio and streaming services, but has so far not delivered. Every year, there are fewer and fewer songs being added to the Great Australian Songbook, John Watson, Australian Artist Manager. We've lost a lot of the infrastructure like smaller labels, smaller curation like community radio, music magazines, even venues. And now algorithmic curation is driving music discovery more than those human communal projects. James Clark, Digital Rights Watch. We need to see a bigger investment in public sector content, in the ABC, funding for community media, and ensuring there are vibrant public spaces out there. These digital platforms capture audiences and then they capture creatives. We do need to look at how to break down their power. Authors. The average annual income for authors is around $18,000. And while there are numerous grants for writers, just 20 to 35% are successful for those that apply. On artificial intelligence, the Australian Society of Authors says the unlicensed use of creative works for training generative AI is a major, unjust threat to the livelihood of the people behind those works and must not be permitted. Craft. We claim Australia is still a nation that can make things. However, the important role of craft was absorbed into the visual arts following the defunding of Craft Australia in 2011. The focus on craft has since withered, and with it, the many skills required in working in materials like clay, glass, wood, metal, and fabric. Craft is also not currently considered a profession or a trade. Teaching art. Where once there were full 4-year degree courses in teaching art and craft for secondary school, the qualification is now just a subject in a broader teaching degree, meaning fewer opportunities for developing the many skills art and craft has to offer, and less depth in fine arts. Artists' living wage. If we truly seek, as the existing national cultural policy would have us do, to ensure that, quote, artists and arts workers have career structures that are long-term and sustainable, supported by vocational pathways, unquote, and that, quote, creative talent is nurtured through fair remuneration, industry standards, and safe and inclusive work cultures, unquote, then we need to pay people to be artists. Ireland has for some years had policies such as income tax exemptions for artists. In addition to this, it recently began a basic income pilot paying €325 a week, around $530 in Australian dollars, to 2,000 eligible artists and arts workers for a period of 3 years. The digital arts. As a matter of urgency, the government should make a significant investment in a specific digital arts fund, either under the auspices of Screen Australia or Creative Australia, to facilitate the development and distribution of Australian arts in the digital industry, promote new revenue streams for live performance artists, stimulate employment growth in the creative arts industry, and enable the best of Australian artistic achievement to be accessed globally. All right, let's talk science. Dr. John H. Howard, no, not that John Howard, from Innovation Australia says, despite having a high proportion of globally ranked universities, Australia's research impact, business R&D investment, and proportion of R&D expenditure relative to GDP remains low. We can be very proud of the work our research agencies do, but compared with other OECD countries, Australia's research funding is low and lowest amongst our major trading partners. Government R&D expenditure for 2024-25 is equivalent to 0.52% of GDP, and despite recent increases, it is still well below the 2021 OECD average of 0.74%. The private sector is now the main funder of R&D, and governments are doing less, with expenditure dropping every year. The federal government invested $14.4 billion in 2023-24 on research and development through R&D tax incentives, university block grants, competitive grants for the NHMRC and Australian Research Council, the CSIRO, and Defence Science and Technology Group. There is no national strategy or national research foundation such as there is in comparable countries. Universities, government, and businesses are not working together on the big research issues facing Australia. We also need to better translate research beyond universities to the real world. Our plan. identify and properly fund the core set of research capabilities necessary for our national interests, and make it easier to fund research translation. Raise R&D expenditure to at least the OECD average of GDP over the next 5 years. Apply transformational research to address food security, clean energy, climate adaptation, and healthcare and well-being. Substantially improve the participation and promotion of diversity, particularly for women and girls in science. Research the social and ethical risks and opportunities of new technologies. Cease conducting research for the fossil fuel industry, and substantially increase expenditure on ongoing support for environmental and wildlife security research. And the evidence. A recent poll, What Australia Thinks, showed Australians want scientific research to be publicly funded, with 67% believing that science is best funded by government rather than private investment. 84% wanted to see more people working in research and technological development. Cuts to the CSIRO have been significant, with jobs lost in health and biosecurity, agriculture and food, manufacturing, and now potentially several hundred in enterprise services. CSIRO spent nearly $11 million on redundancies in 2023-24, $4 million more than the previous year. The gas industry research. The government funds 66% of the cost of the GIS ERA, a CSIRO project that, quote unquote, assists the coal seam gas industry, largely with, quote, community well-being and attitudes to gas developments. In 2023-24, the government contributed $47 million to this sham project. CSIRO also funds research for coal seam gas production. About 70% of Australia's gas production is exported, most of it for the northwest of WA. Coal seam gas reserves have a potential life of 36 years production. Women make up only 34% of the workforce in science, technology, and engineering. Female scientists are almost entirely omitted from Australian curriculum. A study published in the Australian Journal of Education analysed the curriculum of the 4 Year 11 and Year 12 STEM subjects taught in Australian schools: biology, chemistry, physics, and environmental science. It found only one female scientist. British chemist Rosalind Franklin was named in high school curriculums in Queensland, South Australia, and the Northern Territory. The history of science has often seen women's work overlooked and their credit stolen. Biodiversity conservation research. The government spends less than 1% of the federal budget on protecting the natural environment. The CRC program has, in the past, been a major source of innovation for national economic, social, and environmental benefit across a spectrum of environmental issues. These are environmental remediation, water management, weeds, invasive pests, and native animal management. Also, major national responsibilities like Antarctica and World Heritage Areas. However, present priorities and guidelines mean that public good proposals in this sector are disadvantaged when competing against commercial or industrial bids. The number of species known to science that have also had their risk of extinction assessed is just the tip of the iceberg. Many species known to science are too poorly understood to assess their extinction risk, and an even larger number, perhaps 70%, of all Australian species are still unknown to us and have yet to be discovered. Biodiversity is in decline in every state and territory. Climate. Australia needs a national system of long-term research to guide decision-making, particularly for ecological research, which is crucial to understanding the processes over decades in a land of extreme events, droughts, fires, and floods. National Health and Medical Research Council grants are an open, competitive, peer-reviewed source of funding for medical research. In addition, there is an informal system of funding through discretionary grants given by health ministers, many of which are given directly to organisations without formal tender process or peer review. Agriculture. Australian agriculture is forecast to rise by $6 billion to $84 billion in 2025. However, commodity prices are expected to fall in the future, and the government has committed to diversifying our economy with more high-value, advanced manufacturing, but research and development will be crucial to this objective. Now, let's get on to civics and reform the Constitution. So, constitutional reform, not top of the list of priorities, probably for any election. However, it'd be really handy to get it done because I think it might unblock a lot of the issues that the country is facing. So, the Australian people have not agreed to propose changes to the Constitution in more than 3 decades. Only 8 of the 44 referendum proposals have been successful since 1901. The most recent referendum, A Voice to Parliament in October 2023, was politicised, divisive and strongly opposed by the opposition. It's now clear that referenda put forward by the government of the day are unlikely to be won, and so why bother? The facts are that the Australian Constitution is outdated. It is silent on democratic rights, on basic human rights, and those of First Nations peoples. The Constitution holds race powers and lacks jurisdictional clarity on matters such as heads of power and taxation. The Constitution does not refer to a head of state, cabinet, prime minister, political parties, oppositions, or local government. Nor does it mention universal suffrage, compulsory voting, or citizenship rights. The many crossovers in Commonwealth state responsibilities such as health, education, mining, energy supply and infrastructure are costly and inefficient. Many sections in the Constitution are redundant, transitional or flawed. Despite many inquiries and reports, government attempts at constitutional reform have been ad hoc and lacking in strategy, consistency and engagement with the people. So our plan: establish a constitutional reform body to guide and rewrite the Australian Constitution so it is fit for purpose and includes a republic with an Australian head of state, a clear and expressed right to vote in elections, recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as First Nations peoples, clear separation of powers and roles of the executive and judiciary, protecting fundamental human rights through a Bill of Rights, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression, assembly, association and movement, solving jurisdictional issues across parliaments and local government, heads of power, roles, responsibilities and funding matters, modifying Section 44 eligibility requirements for standing for Parliament so dual citizenship and office of profit under the Crown are not disenfranchised, fixing government terms of office, for example, moving federal government terms of office from 3 years to 4 years and bring them in line with the states, and introducing voluntary voting for 16 and 17-year-olds. And here's the evidence. After a series of conventions held during the 1890s, a federal system of government was hammered out and the Commonwealth came into being. The 6 colonies became the 6 states of Australia. Then the Constitution was taken to the people for endorsement. Australia, as well as being a federation of states, is still a constitutional monarchy, and our head of state is King Charles. The King may annul any law for a year after the Governor-General's assent. The 1975 dismissal of the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, demonstrated that the monarchy and its appointed Governor-General could dissolve the Parliament and appoint a caretaker government. The Governor-General's reserve powers are generally agreed to include the power to appoint a Prime Minister if an election has not resulted in a clear outcome, the power to dismiss a Prime Minister if they've lost the support of the majority of members of the House of Representatives, the power to refuse a request for a double dissolution, the power to dismiss a Prime Minister or Minister if he or she breaks the law, the power to refuse a request from a Prime Minister to call an election. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act begins with, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal government under the Crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established, and whereas it is expedient to provide for the admission into the Commonwealth of other Australasian colonies and possessions of the Queen, be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons, in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, as follows, etc. A 2021 Senate inquiry into constitutional reform and referendum says in many other countries, constitutions are reviewed and amended as necessary, but Australia's constitution is stuck, both in language and in meeting the needs of a modern nation. Section 44 is directed to eligibility for election to the Parliament. It sets out a list of 5 disqualifications for being a member of the Commonwealth Parliament. The part of Section 44 that is the primary issue is Section 44I, which recently dealt with allegiance and includes a disqualification for those who are dual citizens. Section 44I says any person who is under any acknowledgement of allegiance, obedience, or adherence to a foreign power, or is a subject or a citizen, or entitled to the rights or privileges of a subject or a citizen of a foreign power, shall be incapable of being chosen or of sitting as a senator or a member of the House of Representatives. Graham Riley from Melbourne University says, the notion that persons have an allegiance to another country because of their descent or the happenstance of their birth, even when they had no knowledge of possessing such citizenship, is clearly implausible. It is also inconsistent with the principle that Parliament ought to be representative of the people it governs. With nearly half of Australians being born overseas or having a parent who was born overseas, the strict requirements in Section 44I seem out of touch with modern Australia. And an editorial note from me, Section 44 continues to bedevil candidates even now. A Greens candidate in the seat of Franklin in Tasmania has been forced to withdraw from the current election after discovering he held New Zealand citizenship. He was previously unaware of this. And I've put a link in the show notes to cover that. Last but not least, let's talk suffrage for 16-year-olds. Full disclosure on this policy platform, I researched and developed this one after listening to a Democracy Sausage podcast on the world of the pre-citizen, in which Dr. Faith Gordon argued strongly for allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. I was pleasantly shocked to discover really compelling evidence as to why we should lower the voting age to 16. So here's the issue. Democracies thrive with broader participation. The expansion of voting rights from men with property to women, to First Nations people, and then to those aged between 18 and 21 in the 1970s has consistently strengthened Australian democracy. In Australia, 16 and 17-year-olds can work full-time, serve in the armed forces, pay income taxes, get married, join political parties, and can be charged with criminal offences. But they cannot vote. They are the generation that will inherit the consequences of decisions made by governments today, but they cannot engage with those decisions and take part in our democracy to shape the governments that make those decisions. Young people consistently report that they feel marginalised and the issues they want action on ignored, precisely because they cannot vote. So our plan: amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act to enfranchise Australians of 16 and 17 years of age on a voluntary basis, with no penalties for non-participation in elections. Maintain compulsory voting and penalties for non-participation in elections for all Australians 18 years and older. Lower the age of pre-registration on the electoral roll from 16 years to 15 years, with current eligibility criteria. Maintain the age eligibility to stand as a candidate in an election at 18, so that candidacy is aligned with the compulsory voting age eligibility. Update the national curriculum to equip young people with the knowledge and skills to participate in our democracy, and ensure that they understand how to vote in local government, state and federal elections. And here's the evidence. A report by UNICEF, Should Children Vote, states, today, countries and territories where children aged 16 and or 17 are allowed to vote in all elections include Argentina, Austria, Brazil, Cuba, Ecuador, Guernsey, Greece, Indonesia, Isle of Man, Jersey, Nicaragua, North Korea, and Timor-Leste. A large number of jurisdictions allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in state and federal elections, so this proposal is not a radical one. Australia has already set a precedent of lowering the voting age from 21 to 18 in the 1970s. One of the first acts of the Whitlam government was to lower the voting age, enfranchising around 700,000 Australians and enabling them to also stand as candidates in federal elections. Governments that ignore young people do so at their peril. While 97.9% of eligible Australians are enrolled to vote, and this has actually increased in the lead up to the current election, this falls to 90% of 18 to 24-year-olds. Yet, youth enrolment smashed the AEC's target of 87% thanks to high enrolment engagement in the lead up to the referendum on the Voice to Parliament in 2023. In 2022, youth enrolment was 86.4% of eligible voters. So in Australia, knowing how to vote is not a precondition for the right to vote. While there will be a portion of the 16 to 17-year-old population who have no interest in or knowledge of politics, this also applies to generations X, Y, and Z, baby boomers, and the silent generation. I met a number of those people on pre-poll in the last couple of weeks. But we do not restrict the right to vote for politically disengaged and low-information adults, and it's a feeble excuse to justify restricting the right to vote to those aged 18 and above. Making voting for 16 to 17-year-olds optional would allow the engaged portion of the population to exercise their right before compulsory voting applies when they turn 18. There is evidence that engaging young voters at a younger age ensures that they are more politically engaged over their lives. Young voters who vote once are more likely to turn out in future elections as well. In order to prepare young people for engagement with politics and their rights as citizens, the national curriculum should be updated to include practical education on voting in all levels of government elections, including assisting students with registering on the electoral roll. Historically, young people between the ages of 18 and 24 tend to be more mobile in their lives as they pursue education and career opportunities, which makes enrolling and participating in voting more difficult for this cohort. In addition, depending on the electoral cycle, there can be a several years gap between their civics education in high school and their participation in state and federal elections. Allowing young people to apply their education on voting as they are acquiring it would contribute to lifelong voting engagement. To quote the conversation, typically electoral data shows that turnout is low when voters are in the early years of adulthood and increases in their mid to late 20s. But 16 and 17-year-olds, when enfranchised, tend to vote in greater numbers than 18 to 24-year-olds. This was the case in Scotland in 2014 to 15, when the voting age was lowered. Now we know that this habit has lasted. As well as having the same cognitive capacity as older Australians, young people today are the best educated and most highly engaged generation in history. Their vote, like their parents', will range across the political spectrum. One thing they agree on is that they want the right to vote and are organising to attain it. To quote Dr. Faith Gordon, there appears to be a bit of a fear from some political parties that this will impact the votes that they receive. But you just would not be asking that about any other social group. And if we did, it would be highlighted as inappropriate to ask. So why do we do that in relation to young people? As the current cohort of 16 and 17-year-olds reach the ballot box and to begin to exercise their voting rights, they'll remember the people and political parties who kept them from it. I hope you found this episode a bit happier and more hopeful than the previous one. One of our listeners on Twitter, the delightful Lemon Submarine, pointed out that in bringing things to light, we can express hope that change can be brought about, which made me feel a lot better about the Health Election podcast, inadvertently being a bit depressing. If you're not following us on social media, you may have missed that I took part in a WA Senate debate with the 6 News Australia team last night. If you missed the live stream, I've put a link in the show notes, and I'm going to check in with the 6 News crew to see if they mind me publishing the audio as a podcast. I'll keep you posted on that. In the meantime, I'll be back as soon as I can with another suite of policy platforms. Take care. Keep the Bastards Honest is brought to you by the Australian Democrats. This episode was edited and produced by me, Elana Mitchell. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Facebook, the platform formerly known as Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Spoutable, YouTube, and TikTok by searching for Australian Democrats. And you can see what we stand for, what we value, and what our policy positions are at our website at democrats.org.au. Email us at info@democrats.org.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.